Okay, good afternoon. My name is Chris Drozdowski. I'm with OriginLab Technical Support. I'll be hosting today's webinars on generating reports with HTML and Markdown. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, traditionally in Origin, going back many years, our traditional reporting mechanism was the report sheet in a workbook. It was a result of some sort of analysis, whether it be a nonlinear curve fit or a statistical analysis, maybe output from one of our apps that did some sort of operation on data. It's hierarchical with tables that expand and contract. One of the limitations, however, of this format is it did not export very well, and it was very difficult, if at all, to customize. And so over the last couple years we toyed with some ideas of how we can improve these reports, and based on a suggestion from one of our distributors, we decided one of the ways we could do this is design a system whereby users can customize their own HTML reports. And that's what this webinar is going to be about today. So let's go ahead and take a look at what our topics are going to be. I'm going to show you some examples of reports. We have two flavors, HTML and Markdown. Then I'm going to go over the syntax, the Markdown syntax, and show you the basics of an HTML page for a report. Then I'm going to show you how you can add links to graphs and tables from your graphs or from these report tables in these reports. I'm going to show you how you can add values to individual cells. Then I'm going to show you how you can add variables that are related to a given import or a given workbook. Next, I'll show you how you can add a report to an analysis template and conduct some batch processing. Then we'll look at how we can style our reports to make them more attractive. Finally, we'll discuss how we can output the report, whether it be printing to a PDF or outputting as a web page. And last, we'll look at how we can take the tables and graphs from this report sheet and put them right into Word by copying and pasting them, so that this report in front of you is then in Word for you to edit and modify and style the way you like in a Word document. So let's look at a couple examples of our HTML type reports. And the first one, which is very simple, is based on it's not a programming language, but it's what's called a markup syntax, and it's actually called Markdown. It's a very simple syntax for creating a very basic web page. This notes window here, we've had notes windows in Origin forever, and they've traditionally been used for as plain text, just putting some notes to yourself in them. But we converted them to be containers for HTML documents. So not only can they provide notes, they can now host HTML. And the simplest one we have is this Markdown report. It's very basic, the one I show you. It has a title, maybe some information about the file, a fitted curve plot, and one table. Well, no, two tables here. A more advanced example, including styling and more sophisticated layout of the tables, is this one. This report is based on HTML. Not only does it have individual tables, they're attractively styled, so they're very visually pleasing. Let's start with looking at how Markdown works. Now you see I have a notes window, and I will show you how this, let me show you this mechanism of how we're going to get to where we can create a Markdown report. And I will start by creating a new blank notes window. And let me just copy this text over. I'll explain it to you in just a minute. Let me just copy this over into the notes window. And I'll go ahead and minimize that. Right now, all we have is a basic notes window. There's nothing special. It's just some text in here. Nothing's going to happen. So what we have to do to trigger this, to turn it into a report, we have to come to this title bar, this top area of this window. And we have to right click, and in the context menu, we go from syntax, we change from text to Markdown. And let's first look at what this is going to produce, and we can come back and look at it individually in code. So let's right click on that title bar again and go to render mode. By the way, this is also controlled by the control key plus M. That takes us back and forth too. So we have a link at the top. This is actually the link where I went to get this markdown syntax. We have different heading levels, and we have some bold text and some italic text, and we have a table. Then we have some other items like a horizontal rule, that's this thin line, a block quote, and two lists, one unordered and one ordered. So I'm going to hit this Control M shortcut I mentioned to go back to the source code, and we can see our headings. Generally, our headings begin with a hash, and we have one hash, two hash, three hash. I believe we go on to have a 4 and 5 hash too for smaller headings. And we have a bold, which is surrounded by two sets of asterisks. And we have an italic, which is one set. By the way, you don't have to remember this today. Like I say, I will put this project up on the internet for you to download, and you'll be notified of it. So when you get the project, then you'll be able to see this syntax. I'm just kind of giving you a good overview. And we have a way to do a table. It's very simple. It's just, there's no sophisticated HTML elements. It's just very simple syntax. And as I say, it produces a very simple report. It's difficult to create a very complex, very elegant report with Markdown, but it's great if you just like things simple and you don't feel like investing in a lot of creating HTML. That being said, we our HTML report, and this is an example here. I don't know if you're familiar or not with creating HTML. It isn't very particularly difficult to do so, and of course there are millions of references and tutorials online how to do so. But it's got a more sophisticated syntax to it. It's more of a complex document. It has a head and a body, and our, for example, our header elements are a little more complex. Let's go ahead and look to make sure what syntax mode we're in by right clicking on the title bar and going to syntax, and we are in HTML mode. So then I can just hit Control M to bring it into render mode, and it looks almost just like our example of Markdown. And I did this intentionally just to show you the difference in the HTML and the Markdown. Again, this is a very simple example of HTML. You can get as sophisticated as you want with an HTML report. So let's move on to the next step. Let's look at actually starting to build a report. I have a report sheet report here. It is a linear fit, and I have the fitted curve plot right here. And we're going to build a report of these two components. And let's start with Markdown. I've got my page started with the highest level header. We'll hit Control M just to look. It's the largest header. Now I want to add, let's say I want to add a graph to this. It's very simple to do this. We're going to navigate to our graph. We're going to go to it. And again, we have this title bar here that I mentioned for the notes window. We also have one for the graph window. I will right click on it and I will choose copy page. And I will come into my notes window where I want to paste it, and I will right click and choose paste link. And when I do so, Origin automatically generates this it's like a field code. It's kind of it's hard to explain, but it is an internal link to that graph. And when I enter rendering mode, Control M, we can see that Origin then puts that graph into this Markdown report. We can go back to the code, and we have a way. By default, it's 400 pixels wide. We could go with a little wider, maybe change it to 600 pixels. Hit Control M, and we've made it bigger. Now let's go back to our code mode, and let's add a table from this report sheet. And maybe we'll go with let's look and see what we have here. Let's go with our parameters table. And this is fairly simple too. I'm going to select the top left cell, right click, and choose copy table text. Not HTML, copy table text. Come back to my Markdown, add a space, right click, and choose paste link. Again, I get one of these field code type texts that is a link. We can see it's a link. It says table, and it looks like almost like a web URL. It's sort of like an origin internal URL to what's called a range, and that range is pointing to this table. So then when we go back to render mode from Control M, we can now see that we've got the table, and it's that simple. It's not complex to do this at all. And I'll show you, I think in a few minutes, a way to do a whole worksheet as a table. So that's very simple. We go to our source, whether it's a graph or a work or a report sheet table. We copy or copy page. We come to our HTML report and we paste link. It's very important that we paste link because that creates a live link from the source to the report. Now let's look at the same thing with HTML. It's going to be very similar. I'm going to repeat the same process, but we're going to get slightly different codes. So we'll go to our graph. Again, we're right-clicking on the column on the title bar of this window. We're going to go to copy page. We're going to go to our report code, click a location, right-click, and choose paste link. Now let's go ahead and do our report table. I'll scroll up, go to my parameters table, select the top left corner cell, right click, choose copy table text, and right click in my report here and choose paste link. And now let's render it. We see this almost the exact same thing, and it's because we use very simple HTML. Now, one of the benefits of HTML is we can apply what is called cascading style sheets to the HTML, and I'll show you an example of that. That's going to take us from having this very rudimentary looking report here to something more elegant, like the one I showed you, the one with the blue background cells at the beginning of today's presentation. So that's how we're going to add graphs and tables to a report. In fact, I don't know if I show this today, but let's go ahead and take a look at one other option. What if we want to add worksheet data to our report? That's pretty simple to do too. We can come down to our worksheet, just a regular origin worksheet, come to our tab here that represents the worksheet, right click and choose copy sheet. Again, right click, copy sheet. And we can come to our report. I'll hit Control M to switch the mode back to code mode. And I'll right click and choose paste link. And when I do that, I get another table tag. And when I enter render mode, I can actually see that we have a data table from a worksheet too. So not only can we pull tables from a report sheet, we can pull regular worksheet data in. Now let's look at the next topic. Instead of graphs and tables, let's look and see what happens when we want to add actual individual cell values. So let me move to the next folder. Again, I have the same report, but instead of just doing the graphs and the table, I'm also going to add a table of the Pearson's R, the R square, and the adjusted R square from my statistics table here. And that's sort of a similar process. We'll start with the markdown. I have a markdown table here. I manually constructed it through the markdown syntax, and I've left an empty cell here for each of these values. So what we do here is we come to our report sheet and we find our Pearson's R cell. We want that individual cell, the value cell. I select it, right click, and choose copy. Then I come over to my target over in my report, find it, right click, and choose paste link. And I'm going to go back and do that for my R square. Select the cell, right click, copy, go to my target, paste link. And let's do that one more time. Adjusted R square, right click, copy, go to target, right click, paste link. And let me just do a little, it needs a little tweaking here after we pasted the link. So let me just hit Control M here, and I can see that now I have a table where I see individual values. I'm not pulling an entire table. Maybe when we want to go back and add more to this, we could go back now and add a graph to it and then add our parameters table. But let's look at the same thing with our HTML report. Before I do anything else, let's look at the basics. I've rendered it. I've got my table here. It actually has row headers instead of column headers, but the data cells are empty, and we're going to populate those real quick. It's the same process. Instead of using the context menus here, we're going to use the keyboard shortcuts for copying and pasting. So we need Pearson's R. We'll select the cell, and I'll hit Control C. And if I come over to my HTML, the right location, I'm just going to look at my keyboard shortcut for pasting link, and that's Control Alt V. So I'll hit Control Alt V to paste a link. And I'll repeat it again. R square COD, Control C, Control Alt V, paste link, adjusted art square, Control C, Control Alt V. So once you get used to it, it's very quick to start building these reports. And those are examples of adding cells. I have a question. This is probably going to be covered in later slides, but how well does it support equation and mathematical symbols? You can support. I am fairly certain what you can do in the HTML report if you use something like MathJax is you can add a link in the HTML to a MathJax library, and probably I'm fairly sure you could embed your MathJax or a similar item, at least in the HTML. I am not sure that our Markdown rendering engine is designed to handle the mathematical symbols. We use a third-party JavaScript library, an open source library, to convert Markdown to actual HTML. I am not sure about that with a Markdown, but I'm probably about 80% sure the HTML route would work just fine. This is something we're checking. Maybe I'll write a blog post about this soon. You can also, by the way, you can also email us at tech support, and we'll take a look at this for you individually. We'll see what we can do. Now let's look at another topic, adding variables. I've got a little trick here that many people aren't aware of in Origin, but it's pretty nifty. I actually have my HTML notes window embedded into a workbook. It is a self-contained unit, not only containing data, but a notes window. You can do this with graphs too. But basically the idea is I've got this embedded notes. I can double click on it to activate it, to bring out my HTML. And this, I believe, this is a Markdown page. And let me show you how you do this while we're here. This is a good trick to know. Let's say you have a notes window here. It's going to be a report. And you want to make this a self-contained unit with this workbook. What we do is we come down to the tab for worksheet. We right click and we choose add notes as sheet. And then Origin's going to pull that notes in. You can do that. It's a slightly different topic, but you can do that with a graph too. Let's say you have a nice graph and you want to embed that, add that into the workbook to make a self-contained unit. This is actually one of the steps of designing an analysis template. But with a graph, we just come to that little worksheet tab, right click, and choose add graph as sheet. And then we have a graph. We can also delete to remove it. And let's clean up a little bit. We're going to delete the graph. Let's just clean up a little bit. And we're back where we are. So I've pulled out this embedded notes window, and the reason I embedded it is the most of the variables I'm going to show you, or rather some of them, are actually linked to this workbook because I imported data in, and these are variables related to importing. And some of the variables we can do is the path and file name of the current project. And I'll show you kind of give you an idea of the codes. We look at the formatted file data, the imported file. We can do things like looking at the path of your user files folder. We have a notation that lets you just pull things like the default imported file date or the file name of the imported file. Those come from this workbook I imported into. Let's hit Control M to toggle to our code mode. This is the notation of the variables. And again, I don't expect you to memorize this today. This project will be available for you to use as a reference here in a few days. For example, we define variables in that idea, that internal origin URL, instead of how we had table or we had graph or we had cell. We have one called string here, str. And that points to some string registers. String registers are a form of an internal variable. It's like a global variable in origin that stores some sort of information. And I've built a path to the current project from those. And I've enclosed it in this field code with a string URL. One of the things these string notation lets us do is you can actually call a LabTalk function. For example, I've got one of the internal variables associated with importing into a workbook are the page info tree of variables. And one of those is the import date. I'm calling a LabTalk function here that takes that raw import date and customizes the output date so it looks good. We also have things like a path to a user files folder. Then we have another notation instead of string, which lets us do things like call LabTalk functions. We have a simpler one called var, and var just puts out a variable. In this case, from that page info I just mentioned, the import file date in its default format, or the file name in its default format. So again, let's look at those codes. And as I said, generally most of these codes would be associated with an imported file, and it needs to be linked with a specific workbook. Hence why I put this report, why I embedded it into this workbook. That's how I need to make that link to those page info variables. It's got to have they have to be linked together for those to work. Now let's take a look. And we do have, and we do have an answer here. Let me read for questions. Okay, my colleagues have answered some questions. Examples of code that generates output programmatically. Okay. All right. Well, we'll talk a little bit about output later. This is an area we do need some improvement on. I will bring it up a little bit later. Let's look at another subject. Doing using an HTML report as part of an analysis template. I'm not going to show you how we create these analysis templates. That's a good subject for other webinars, but the whole basic idea is I brought some data in, I graphed it, and this is where I embedded that graph into that workbook. I embedded this graph. Then I did a fitting of this graph. Let me park it back in the workbook. It was a nonlinear curve fit. I generated a report, and it's got an associated nonlinear. It's got the curve data here. Now let's take a look at the report I generated from this. We started out with a table with individual cell lengths, or actually in this case, I think these are variables. Let's take a look. I will hit Control M. Yes, actually I have a mix of cells from the report table and a variable for the import file name. We'll go back. I brought that graph in. I did that copy page and then paste link with a graph. I copied the amplitude table from the report sheet. So I built this report, and since we're doing a batch processing, and I'm going to do the type of batch processing rather than having a summary, that we retain our workbooks. We're going to do a bulk import into this workbook, and I'll show you how it'll generate a new HTML report for each data set. So what we want to do is we want to come in and activate our data sheet, the sheet we imported into, and I'm going to come to the title bar, and I'm going to right click and choose Save as Analysis Template. This is standard analysis template actions. And let me name it something. My analysis template. Okay. I could have called it my HTML report template or something. So maybe a week later, we get some data files we generated. We'll come in and choose File. I need to actually activate a workbook for the menu to show up properly. We'll choose File, Batch Processing, and then our batch processing dialog that will show up here in just a minute. Origin is smart enough to pick up my analysis template. It just happens to be the only one I have in my user files folder, so it's smart enough to pick it up. It's asking me for files to import from. So I'm going to go to my webinar folder. This is the August 2020 generating report folder. Go to my data folder, change the file type, and let's just choose a few of these CSV files. Add them, say OK. I need to first determine my data sheet. Origin was smart enough to figure that out for me. I don't have a result sheet. A result sheet is part of an analysis template when you were doing summary batch processing. So I'm going to say none. And this is the thing. When I say there is no result sheet, it's then Origin disables this delete intermediate workbook. That's going to keep the workbook it generates. When I click OK, it's going to start batch processing, bringing that data in. And let me check my questions. Okay, we have a few more programming questions I just can't talk about right now. We can see that we have a report for each of these. One of our limitations, unfortunately, is we cannot render the report while it's embedded into the workbook. We've had requests for this, and it's something we're going to investigate. We just haven't had the resources yet to devote programming time to doing this. But that's something we're looking forward to doing down the road. But we've created a new HTML report for each imported file. Now let's take a look. As I said, these are very kind of visually rudimentary. They're not real pleasant to look at. The way we would style report, and again, I don't expect you to remember this, I will provide this to you, is through what's called cascading style sheets. It is for lack of a better word, is a web programming language that lets us add style to HTML elements. And I've provided an example here. I am styling tables, and there's all this code here to do fancy things. You don't have to do this for your CSS. I just kind of did a very thorough example, and you can actually borrow this if you wish. Let me activate my report. And what we're going to do, we're going to come in and we're going to hit Control M to go back to our syntax mode. And generally speaking, CSS, these styles, go in a style tag under what's called a head tag in an HTML document. So I've got this empty style element. Let me hit return a few times just to make some room to make it clear. And I'll come over to this notes window. It's just a plain notes window. It has this CSS. I'll hit Control A, just select all and copy it. And then when I come over to my HTML, I'll just paste that right into that style tag. So we see we've added this special cascading style sheets, these style sheet elements into that head. And when I hit Control M now, we can see that our HTML has been transformed into something much more attractive. It's got nicer colors. It's got some padding, nicer fonts. We've got our what's known as zebra striping on our table here. So that's how you're going to go about styling. And I'll actually let you in on a little secret. if you do it right, you can actually apply styling to Markdown reports. The way our converter from Markdown to actual HTML works is it lets you have embedded HTML in that Markdown. It's just, it's kind of a trick that we don't publish, but can happen. Now let's take a look let's look at outputting. We've got these reports. How are we going to get them out of Origin? And we have two options. One is to print to a PDF, and the other is to export a web page. Let me bring in a report over here. Let me find which is my report. Let me drag this into my output folder. So I have this attractive peak report. We've seen this before in this webinar. I want to print this out as PDF, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to you can right click on the title bar and choose print. It should show print, but that's going to print to your default printer. And unless you know what your default printer is, it might, instead of going to a PDF, it might go to actually your printer. So let's go in File. We'll go to Print, ... from the File menu. And let's give it a minute. And I'm going to select the Microsoft Print to PDF driver. Let me get it up there. It's a mighty small dialog. And I'll say print. And when I do, it's going to prompt me for a location for my PDF. So let me find that. Desktop, August, webinar. We'll just print it right here. No, that's the wrong webinar. Pardon me. August generating reports. And I'll just call it something report 1. And I'll say save. So it's going to go and print. And let me come over here off screen for a second. Open up a Explorer window, go to my reports, double click on the PDF and open it. And we can see that our HTML report has been made into a PDF. Right now, this process, unfortunately, is GUI based. We have not been able to figure out how to completely automate that print process programmatically. That's something we're going to work on. So that's how you get to a PDF. We also have the option, we can export this as an actual web page to look at an external browser. This time I'll go to my title bar, right click and choose export to web page. And it's put me in the right folder, but let's call it something useful. It gives us this sort of a difficult to recognize name for this HTML. So I'm just going to call it report 2 and choose save. And now we'll go back to our Windows Explorer window. We can see we have report 2 HTML. Let me double click and I'll open this in my default browser, which is Firefox. And then I can see in Firefox I have the report. So that's how we get, those are the two ways right now we get our reports out of, our HTML reports out of Origin. Let's look at another way we can get report data. Instead of using HTML, we're going to look at a way we can get report data from a report sheet into a Microsoft Word document. I brought back my linear fit. Is this linear fit? Yes, it's my linear fit report. Let's look at how we're going to take this into a Word document. Let me launch Word for a moment. Blank document. And let's look at let me just auto hide my ribbon. Maybe I don't want to do that. All right, so so we've set aside the HTML inside Origin for now. Let's look at how we can move to Word. Again, I'm going to go to this report sheet. And I'm going to select that top left cell. This time I'm going to choose Copy Table HTML. And go to Word, right click, and I have pasting options. I can keep the source format. It doesn't show up well. I can keep this what's called merge formatting. and bring in that table and its footnotes. What's really nifty here is I can then change things about this. I can come in and select the whole table, maybe change the font to something else, Times New Roman, maybe 12. I can change my cell backgrounds to something else. So I can then customize this in Word by copying and pasting those tables. Let me undo everything just to come back. We can also, and this is an interesting trick, and hopefully it'll work all right with me. We can expand our tables. We can look at our expanded tables. So notes, and we'll go into one of our top left cells, and this time we're going to choose copy all open tables HTML. We'll come to Word, and hopefully this will work well for me. Sometimes it's a little bit glitchy, and we can look at options for pasting. For example, here it doesn't want to quite paste right for me. Let me go back to Origin. Let's try and see if we can do it on a different table. Copy all open tables HTML. It should get this. I don't know why it doesn't. Let me find Word. I don't know if this is a Word issue or an Origin issue, but it just doesn't want to render. Let's see what happens then. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. Unfortunately, for a minute today, it doesn't work. But that's the idea. We'll come in and let's just clear everything out. We'll copy a table. Oh, our parameters. Copy table, HTML. Go to Word. Right click. Paste. Key. You can either do merge formats or paste formats. And I think this issue with the copying and pasting multiple tables, I actually think that may be a Word issue and not so much an Origin one. But we'll remember this is fairly common here. We're going to bring over our graphs too. But we're all familiar with this. We just come in and choose copy page and go to Word and paste it. So this is an option for building a report in Word. Let's give it a moment to get that graph over. There we go. So that's how we can that's how we can create a report in Word directly from a report in Origin. And I think that we've mostly for the day wrapped things up for today's webinar. Let's take a look at, first I want to review what we did, and second I want to take a few minutes now just to ask you to do that polling. So if my polling coordinator wants to start while I review, that'd be great. We provided an introduction. I sort of gave a history of Origin and reports. I showed you a couple of examples, including a fancy HTML report and a simpler Markdown report. We looked over the Markdown syntax. By the way, I did a little trick there. When I'm in the rendered mode, I can double click to go back to my code mode. I showed you basics of the HTML page, kind of the structure, what it looks like. We looked at adding graphs and tables to a report. We looked at adding individual cell values to a report. Then we looked at adding variables, and we learned about embedding that notes window into the workbook. Then we looked at an analysis template with an HTML report, and we looked at how we can do that batch processing to generate multiple reports. Next, we looked at styling a report. I talked a little bit about this idea of the cascading style sheet, putting it where to put it in our HTML. Then we talked about outputting, either printing to PDF or exporting as a complete web page. Finally, we talked about transferring to Word, how we can copy from our report sheet tables into Word. We saw we had a little glitch there. It's a little bit frustrating, but that's okay. And I think that's it for today. And we're going to sit for a minute and we're going to let people finish their polls. And I'm going to look see if there are any other questions. If me or my colleagues missed any questions, we're sorry. How does it handle pagination in the PDF output? Can you push a report to OneNote? Here's a couple things. One, the pagination is going to depend actually on the printer, I think. I know in HTML you can handle page breaks and pagination via well, not HTML, via cascading style sheets. Uh, but I think in this, you can do that, and I think that's supported okay. I think I tested that a couple years ago. But the pagination, by and large, with page numbers, is also handled by the printer of the browser. This is in a way what this window here, just so you know, this is actually Internet Explorer 11 sitting here inside this notes window. We have no control that it's Internet Explorer 11, but that's what it is. We can't change it to Firefox or Chrome or Edge or anything, but that's what's rendering here. This is actually the rendering engine of IE 11. Hence, when we print it, it's as if IE 11 is printing. Pushing reports to OneNote. We did have a plug-in app for Origin for pushing things to OneNote. It was based on technology called COM, and then Microsoft dropped COM support from OneNote. So now they have a completely different API for managing OneNote. I think it's a REST-based API for pushing and pulling into OneNote, and our app developers looked into that, and it got fairly complicated, and they had to back off from it because of priorities. So maybe we need to revisit that OneNote, and maybe you can ping us with an email after the webinar to remind us, and we can look into that again. Okay, do we have any other questions today? All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to attend today's webinar. As I said, we have more webinars coming up next week and the week after and the week after through the end of September and possibly longer. I hope I presented useful material for you. Again, this webinar is recorded and will be put online in a few days. And this project will be put online for you to download in a few days. Other than that, thank you for taking the time and have a nice afternoon.